Well, Mark, we move into the second episode of our true crime series of crime during the Second World War. And this episode concerns gangs of London. So, Mark, I think it'd be quite good to know, just sort of set the scene for the listeners so that we can really understand the kind of state of play as regards gangs in London at the beginning of the war and throughout the war.
Hi, Ollie, and hello, everyone. As we discussed in podcast one, there was a crime boom in the war. Crime rose 60% in England and Wales between 1939 and 1945, and much of this crime was gang-related. Gangs were among the first to see the huge potential of the black market. They also foresaw the great scope for crime offered by the blackout and the fact that the police force was to be significantly stretched by loss of personnel to the forces and by the side effects of war, such as looting. The focus of this podcast is wartime gang crime in London, but it's difficult to look at that in isolation from what happened before the war and what happened after. Accordingly, I'll be touching on all three periods. So first off, let's start with looking at the gang which predominated in the 30s at the outset of the war, the Sabinis. They were the biggest name in the period between World War I and World War II. They were Italians from Clerkenwell, or strictly speaking, half Italians, as they had a Scottish mother. They became known ultimately as either simply the Sabini gang or the Italian mob. Ottavio Sabini was the oldest of 7 boys. Their father was an Italian immigrant from Parma, also called Ottavio. Ottavio Jr. used several names throughout his life, but the one he was best known by was Darby Sabini. Darby Sabini was born in 1888 and was good to go on to be top dog in the London underworld in the interwar years. The Sabini gang began to be a real force in the 20s. They were active in a wide range of criminal activities, but the one that propelled them to the top of the tree was the gang's dominance of racetrack crime. Since 1845, racing had been the only legitimate gambling activity allowed in Britain. It had always been a focus of criminal activity, but in the 20s, the main activity revolved around protection rackets. There were a number of racecourse protection rackets. The main related to the on-course bookies and their pitches. Racecourse criminals established control of the bookies and their pitches by threatening to frighten punters away from the pitch, unless the bookies paid them a £5 or £10 fee for the day, usually phrased as a non-repayable loan. This was big money in the 20s, and there were many racecourse pitches at every meeting which the gangs fought over and tried to establish dominance in. There were other simple ways in which the criminal gangs were able to make money. For example, the bookies required a racer's running sheet to do their business. The gangs took over the production of these at minimal cost and charged the bookies £0.50 for the service. Chalk had to be bought for the bookies' blackboard, and this too was supplied by the gangs at a significant markup, as were the stools the bookies sat on. Putting all this together, there were huge returns to be made. A gang might clear £4,000 or £5,000 in a day at a good course.
So, Mark, just reminding us all, what was the rate in those days compared with today?
Roughly, it's 40 times today. £1 is £40 today. Big, big money. On Derby Day, when pitch protection fees were marked up, the money might be 3 times as much. So £15,000 times 40, if I can do the sums, £600,000.
Excellent. Big, big money, as you say.
Going back to the Sabinis, when they first turned their attention to the racecourses, they had competition. The principal competition came from Billy Kimber's Brummagem Boys. That's Brummagem for Birmingham. Fans of Peaky Blinders might want to take note at this point. Kimber had established a controlling position at several southern courses by the early 20s, as well as some in the north. The arrival of the Sabinis on the racing scene obviously brought friction with the Brummagem Boys, as well as with other gangs like the Yiddishers and the Whites. Both Darby and Billy Cumber were the victims of violent assaults along the way. The Sabinis went after Kimber's prime southern racecourses and eventually got them after Kimber's gang came off worse in the infamous Epsom Road Battle of 1925, an epic brawl of gang thugs. You might wonder where the police and the jockey club were in all this. The answer is they pretty much sat back and allowed the gangs to get on with it. This changed to some extent in 1929 when the Jockey Club tried to restrict gang racecourse activity, and the police, too, became more proactive against the gangs. Darby Sabini's response to this was to diversify. He shifted much of his horse racing activity to greyhound racing, which had been introduced to Britain in its modern form in the mid-20s. By its modern form, I mean with that little electric bunny running around the track. It was very popular. By 1927, there were 40 dog tracks in operation in the UK. In addition to dominating this new racing market, Darby and his brothers began to build up a portfolio of illegal gaming and drinking clubs in central London. Again, this move inevitably produced friction with other gangs like the Whites, but in 1934, an accommodation was reached under which the Sabinis got control of the West End, while the Whites had control of King's Cross and the surrounding areas. The White Gang consequently became better known as the King's Cross Gang. So the Sabinis were in a very strong position at the top of the London underworld when the war began in 1939. The only crime activity in which there were not top dogs was, out of choice, the vice industry, which was dominated by Maltese gangs, principally the Messina brothers, of whom more later. However, the advent of war was to prove disastrous for the Sabinis. Within a very short time, they were ousted from their top position, never to return. Main cause of this decline was Mussolini's entrance into the war in June 1940. Soon after his declaration of war on Britain, many Italian men were rounded up and interned. Although the Sabinis were all born and bred in London and were only half Italian, the authorities took advantage of the situation to get them off the streets. Darby and some of his brothers were swiftly interned. The King's Cross Gang and others were quick to take advantage of Darby's removal from the scene. Darby was held in the internment camp for a year, then almost as soon as he was out, he was convicted of receiving stolen goods and sent down for 3 years. By the time Darby got out of prison, the war was over and the Sabini's predominance was long gone. His operations now were in the hands of the King's Cross Gang and other big new players like Billy Hill and Jack Spot, of whom more later. After the war, Darby opted for the quiet life, setting up shop as a bookie in Hove. He died in 1950 at the age of 62, but lives on forever in Graham Greene's classic book, Brighton Rock, as he was the model for Greene's gangster Collioure.
So, Mark, that's fascinating stuff, particularly about Graham Greene. Mark, moving on to the next gang, this covers Billy Hill, who actually I have heard of, but I'm certainly not familiar with. So I'm looking forward to hearing about Billy Hill.
Well, he was probably the biggest criminal of the period that we're talking about. And even in his retiring years, he became known as the mentor to the Krays. Well, he had a fascinating long career, and I'll now tell you a little bit about it. Most criminal gangs operating in London between 1939 and 1945 profited from the wartime favourable conditions and opportunities, but Billy Hill and his gang probably did the best. He and his gang made a huge success of their black market operations, while also being involved in a huge range of traditional criminal activities. Hill was particularly successful in large-scale robberies and smash and grabs, although that success was leavened to some extent by having the odd period in jail. So, who was Billy Hill? William Charles Hill was born of Irish parents in 1911 in Seven Dials in London. Now a smart part of the West End, Seven Dials was where Fagin's pickpocketing headquarters was located in Oliver Twist, and for centuries had been a deprived and dangerous area of London, teeming with criminals and poverty-stricken inhabitants. It was still thus in 1911. Billy Hill was one of 21 children, several of whom didn't make it to adulthood. His solidly working-class parents moved to Camden Town when Hill was 3, and it was there that he grew up. Hill's father tried to make a legitimate living as a painter-decorator, but mixed with many well-known criminals. Billy ran with street gangs and started thieving at a young age. It was not long before he was in trouble with the law. As a young teenager, he was caught stealing from a tobacconist's kiosk in Regent's Park and was sentenced to 5 years in reformatory. He managed to get this over-harsh sentence reduced on appeal to probation. Soon Hill moved on to house burglary. A job as a greengrocer's delivery boy opened his eyes to potential rich pickings available among the area's smarter residences. He steadily made his way up in the pre-war London underworld, graduating from burglary to racecourse protection and various other large-scale crimes. By the time the war began, Hill was a seasoned criminal with a prominent name among his fellow criminals. He had also built up a group of loyal associates. I love this bit, the names. Men like Square Georgie Ball, Birdie Short, Tosh Hughes, Horrible Harry, Scarface Jock, Teddy Hot Legs Hughes, Bert the Long Reach, and Wide Gators. With men like these, he carried out a series of spectacular smash and grab raids in the 30s. He'd also acquired a reputation as a man not to be crossed. Several villains who had tried their luck had been slashed in the face or worse by Hill's faithful Chiv. Chiv, for those of you who don't know, is slang for a knife. Hill was quick to move into the black market as the war got underway. With rationing and the general war situation, all sorts of things quickly became scarce. Food, clothes, petrol, cigarettes, and many more. Ration books were required to purchase many items, and purchase allowances were very tight. At its simplest, the black market meant criminals stealing scarce items and selling them to the public at a very high markup. But there were other opportunities for Hill in this area. There was money to be made from forging ration books and clothing and petrol coupons. There was also money to be made from stealing large supplies of ration books and coupons, and Hill and his gang led the way in these sorts of activities. At the same time, Hill continued to rob and steal on a large scale, assisted by the blackout and the fact the police were greatly overstretched. His operations still obviously involved a high degree of risk, and his luck was not always in. In June 1940, he and his gang pulled off a dual robbery in London's West End. The robbery itself went off fine, but the getaway car broke down, and Hill and a couple of his men got nicked. He did a year and a bit in Chelmsford Prison. His gang, however, remained fully intact and continued to operate at full tilt under Hill's direction from jail. As a well-known and respected criminal, he enjoyed a reasonably cushy time in Chelmsford, living rather like the Noel Coward character in The Italian Job, and enjoying various benefits unavailable to his fellow prisoners. Hill got out of prison at the end of 1941 and went back to work. He found that having served prison time had enhanced his reputation in the underworld. Hill was an inventive man. As petrol was strictly rationed, police often pulled cars over to check if the drivers were out on the road legitimately. This was obviously an inconvenience to gang out on a job. Hill's solution was to borrow a hearse from a friend who was an undertaker. The police always waved it through at any roadblock. Often, if a safe was involved in a job, instead of trying to blow it open on site, Hill would transport it to a special garage he had and blow it there. At some point during the war, he decided to get the gang a safe house out in the country. So if they had a job outside London, they didn't have to run the risk of driving back into town. He found an ideal big house at Bovingdon in Hertfordshire. There was a huge barn on the property in which the proceeds of crime, black market goods and cars could be stored and safes could be blown. Hill estimated later that the count of safes blown in Bovingdon ran well into the hundreds. While it was known in the London underworld that Hill had a safe house, its location never leaked. Hill was a man of great self-discipline. He was a very moderate drinker and encouraged his gang members to be likewise. Drinks are mugs, he said, and they're usually unpleasant mugs at that. He did have one weakness, though, which was smoking. He was a heavy smoker, and this was a big factor in his death years later. As Hill became more prominent and powerful, he turned his attention to Soho and the West End, which, as we've seen, was the domain of the Sabinis at the beginning of the war. When they lost their position, it was Alf White's King's Cross gang which initially took over, but they couldn't stop Hill from moving in and taking over some of the clubs and gaming operations. Inevitably, there was violence, an occasion for Hill to wield his trusty chiv. He was involved in a number of nasty fights as the war went on. While a highly intelligent and often charming man, let there be no mistake, Hill was a man of violence to whom torture was a frequently used tool of his profession. As his gang went from strength to strength, there really was little need for Hill to take an active part in gang jobs. However, he loved doing so, and he ended up paying the price in a robbery towards the end of the war. Disappointed at having to pull out of a long-planned robbery, he hurried to get on with another, a large post office robbery in Islington. As in the West End jewellery job he'd been jailed for at the beginning of the war, the actual robbery went fine. However, in this case, a lorry driver saw Hill and his men throwing the post office money bags into the getaway car and chose to ram it. Hill was nicked again and was given a 4-year stretch in Dartmoor. So when the war ended, Hill was in jail, running his gang successfully from inside, as before. He didn't serve his full sentence, and once out of Dartmoor, got back to business as usual. So what happened to Hill in post-war London? Despite his spell away, his position as king of the underworld seemed clearly established in the immediate post-war years, and he managed to maintain it for many years until he chose to pass the baton on to the Krays. His principal competition in the late 40s and 50s was a Jewish gangster known as Jack Spot, who I'll be moving on to later. The continuance of rationing for many years after the war meant that the black market continued to flourish, while Hill continued to carry out audacious robberies and ran various new rackets like intercepting post office parcels. One of Hill's most audacious robberies, a postal van raid in 1952, netted his gang £287,000, and I've done the arithmetic in advance here, Ollie, 10.5 million in today's money. In 1954, they netted the more modest but still substantial amount of £40,000 in a bullion raid. No one ever got arrested for these operations. For a while, Hill and his main rival Spot got along all right. They even went on a French family holiday together in 1951. Eventually, however, their relationship deteriorated and violence broke out. In 1957, Hill arranged a knife attack on Spot, the ramifications of which ultimately led to Spot's fall from grace. The house in Bovingdon remained in use for many years. In addition to black market goods, cars and stolen safes, the barn now stored a huge arsenal of weapons. Hill lived it large, dressing in style and dining out at the best restaurants and clubs. Married, apparently happily, to his loyal wife of many years, Aggie, he began to take mistresses. During the post-war years, Hill diversified and became a big property investor, occasionally abroad. In one strange interlude in 1947, he acquired an interest in a South African nightclub. Sought by British police for a warehouse robbery, he did a run at Johannesburg. His club investment precipitated a run-in with local gangsters, which in turn got Hill into trouble with the local police. He was forced to return to London with another prison stretch awaited him, this time 2 years. He finally decided, while serving this sentence, to drop out of active participation in gang jobs and to leave them to his men. As before, while in prison, this time Wandsworth, he ran his gang successfully from inside. Hill continued to expand his club business in Soho and the West End after the war, always getting one of his men to front up in case of police trouble. New competitors would occasionally appear, but Hill would see them off. One new gang which appeared on the scene in the 50s was that run by the twin brothers Ronnie and Reggie Cray. They posed no immediate threat as they looked up to and respected Hill, who became something of a mentor. Hill diversified geographically as well in the 50s. His gang took on successfully jobs in the north of England and in France. Eventually, things were going too well. It went a little bit much to Hill's head, and he began to give newspaper interviews in which he referred to himself as the gangster who runs London's underworld. He even had his memoirs ghosted. Somehow, the police turned a blind eye. Hill's position was such that he acquired a certain influence in the legitimate world. For example, in 1953, champion jockey Sir Gordon Richards was burgled, and one of the items stolen was a much treasured gold cigarette case given him by King George V. Hill, as a keen fan of the turf, was outraged. He put the word out in the criminal world that the stolen items should be returned very quickly. They were. This good deed of Hill's had an unforeseen effect. News of it encouraged other rich burglary victims to offer Hill money to retrieve their stolen items. Thus, Hill found himself playing a similar role to that played by an infamous predecessor, the 18th century thief-taker Jonathan Wild. By the end of the 50s, Hill was seriously eyeing up retirement. The Crays were anxious to step into Hill's shoes and were making their anxiety known. He gradually began scaling down his operations, spending more of his time in his Bayswater flat or in sunnier foreign climes with Gypsy, the one of his mistresses, to finally replace Hill's wife, Aggie. He acquired holiday villas in Marbella and Tangier, where he bought another nightclub. He remained a much respected figure in the London criminal community and was much deferred to and often asked to advise on jobs. In fact, he's rumoured to have had some involvement with the Great Train robbery. While Hill slowly withdrew from his main activities, he still remained open to occasional new opportunity, allegedly in partnership with John Aspinall, proprietor of the Claremont Gaming Club. He participated in a lucrative card scam in which various high rollers were cheated out of their money. Eventually in the 70s, Hill gave up his foreign properties and settled back full-time in England. He and Gypsy fell out and he took up with a much younger African showgirl called Diana, with whom he had his one and only child, a son called Johnny. Diana had mental problems and committed suicide in 1983. Hill never got over this and became something of a recluse in his Bayswater flat, while Gypsy took on the upbringing of his son. As mentioned earlier, Hill had always been a heavy smoker, and his health went downhill as he carried on despite the warnings of his doctor. He died at the age of 72 in 1984. The funeral was a low-key family affair in Manor Park in East London. He had no will, but reputedly left a large fortune in a Swiss bank account for Gypsy and his son.
So, Mark, we've heard about Billy Hill there, and we have another character from the East End called Jack Spot. So, can you talk a little bit about him?
Yes, indeed. And Jack Spot was a larger-than-life character who played a major role in wartime and post-war crime. His proper name was Jack Spot Comer, known to all as Jack Spot, and he was born of Polish-Jewish stock in Mile End in the East End of London in 1912. Different reasons have been given at times for the Spot nickname, but the likeliest is that he had a large black mole on his left cheek. Like his future rival, Billy Hill, he got into thieving at an early age. Somehow he managed to stay out of jail. As a teenager, he had a number of short-lived jobs, such as tailoring and working in a barber shop, before joining the Merchant Navy for a while as a boy. After leaving the Navy, he fell in with a rough bunch of East End contemporaries, several of whom were to be his long-standing partners in crime. Again, and I enjoy this bit, more no lovely names, Moshe Blue Ball Goldstein, and yes, he had a blue testicle. His cousin Solly the Turk Kankus, Bernard Sonny the Yank Shack, and Jaime the Yid Rosen, who happened to be an accomplished boxer in his youth, as indeed was Spot, who was a big man of over 6 feet. When he was 16, Spot fell in with an older friend who was running a protection racket in Petticoat Lane. Then he expanded into other criminal activities. In 1933, he received his first conviction when he was bound over in the sum of £2 for loitering with intent to steal from motor cars. It was to be one of a relatively small number of convictions over a long criminal career. After this, he went into partnership with an experienced burglar called Frank Taffy Osmond. This ended in 1935 when he got caught and luckily managed to get only 2 years probation. From then on, he concentrated mostly on protection and the race courses. Somewhere along the way, he picked up a wife and child. Spot gained a reputation as a protector of Jews. Much of this reputation appears to have been self-generated, and in any event, if any protecting was done, it was done for a fee. He claimed throughout his life to have been one of the more prominent of the Jewish East Enders, who took on Oswald Mosley's fascists when they marched there in 1936. Again, Spot's veracity in claiming this is doubted. Like Billy Hill, Jack Spot was a well-known figure in the London underworld when the war broke out, but he wasn't quite as far up the ladder. Like Hill, he also kicked off the war with a spell in prison, his crime being not one of dishonesty, but of violence. He was convicted for slashing a man with a knife in a club. When he came out, he joined the army. He never went on active service and somehow managed to get out when the war still had some time to run. Back in London, he resumed his wide range of criminal activities with his gang. One day, he got into a fight in a club on the Edgware Road. He got into a lot of fights, which he usually attributed to having to battle anti-Semitism. In this instance, he bashed in someone's head badly with a teapot. Frightened of being arrested and sent back to prison, he decided to get out of town. He went to Leeds and got involved in the protection racket there. Leeds had its fair share of illegal gambling and drinking clubs, and Spot teamed up with a local operator called Jack Milky Marks. He also went into action in the local horse and dog race courses. In all, he had a successful time of it at Leeds, but eventually decided to risk going back to London. He was in due course arrested for the teapot assault, but pleaded self-defense and got off. He continued to have a finger in the Leeds protection racket pie, and his gang also started rackets in Manchester and Birmingham. He also increased his profitable presence in the northern race courses. In London, his new focus of activity was Bottles, an illegal gaming club which masqueraded in the daytime as the Aldgate Fruit Exchange. His partner in this was another Jewish gangster, Abe Korsky. During the daytime, clerks in white collars and black hats sat at desks amongst empty fruit crates, pretending to do business. At 5, they left, and the place was transformed. By 7 o'clock, it was what Spot claimed to be the biggest gaming club London had ever known. Members of Spot's gang manned the gaming tables where Chemin Fer, Faro, and Rummy were the games played. Stakes could be very high. Quite a few very wealthy black marketeers were among the customers, and stakes of several £1,000s were not uncommon, or so Spot claimed when he too, like Hill, published his memoirs. The secret of the Aldgate Fruit Exchange's true identity became an open one, but it remained untouched thanks to bribery of the police. Spot himself was usually the bagman carrying large bags of money on a regular run to Victoria Police Station. Eventually, the Aldgate Club was closed down, but Spot and Corsley successfully moved it to another location off Fenchurch. Eventually, the Aldgate Club was closed down, but Spot and Corsley successfully moved it to another location off Fenchurch Street. By the end of the war, Spot was a very rich man, and his underworld ranking had moved much closer to that of top dog Billy Hill. In the post-war years, he began to vie with Hill for that top spot. As mentioned earlier, for several years, the two men were on reasonable terms, and indeed on occasion worked together. Spot, with his continuing northern activities, maintained a generally wider spread of operations than Hill. Spot's peak was reached in the early 50s. At that point, he remained a particularly prominent operator in the horse and dog courses and in gaming clubs, while also taking on various thieving jobs. There are also stories, unproven, that he and Hill got into the contract killing business. In 1953, however, things began to slide. Rumors that he'd grasped competitors to the police took hold, and he began to lose gang members and respect. Unlike Hill, he'd never been a good payer to his men, and their loyalty was accordingly thinner. When Hill's memoirs were being written, Spot foolishly picked a fight with Hill's ghostwriter, and the two gangsters fell out. By 1955, Spot found himself being edged out of his hold on the racecourses. Then, in the summer of that year, Spot got involved in a knife fight in Soho with a well-known Italian gangster called Big Albert Dimes, who'd been close to the Sabinis. Both men ended up seriously hurt. Spot had stab wounds all over his face and body. When recovered, both men were arrested and charged with wounding to commit grievous bodily harm. Pending trial at the Old Bailey, Spot was remanded to Brixton Prison. While he was in jail, Hill, who was helping pay for Dimes' defense, continued to work on separating Spot's men from their boss's orbit. The trial, which was something of a public sensation, began in late September of 1955. With the aid of a bribe-bent vicar and another dodgy witness, Spot got off, while Dimes was acquitted on a technicality. Delighted as Spot was with the verdict, the exposure of his character and weaknesses in the press proved to be another nail in the coffin of his criminal career. His problems continued when the vicar spilled the beans on his false evidence, and there were prosecutions of Spot's associates, though not of Spot himself. Spot then compounded his problems by employing a hitman called, somewhat appropriately, Joe Cannon, to shoot Hill and Dimes. Dimes heard of the plan and warned Cannon off. Hill decided Spot's action could not be allowed to pass unpunished, and in May 1956, Spot was attacked, when with his second wife, Rita, by a group of men in a Paddington street. He was viciously slashed, but survived. Spot at first named names, but then withdrew his evidence. His wife, however, would not withdraw hers, and she named Hill, Dimes, the subsequently infamous Mad Frankie Fraser, and a man called Bobby Warren as the assailants. In the end, Hill and Dimes avoided charges, but Fraser and Warren got 7-year sentences. Spot was now permanently cast as a stool pigeon and was finished. Hill took over all of Spot's West End interests, and other gangsters the rest. Perhaps surprisingly, Hill and his other enemies allowed Spot to live out his life in quiet obscurity. A long and colourful life ended in 1996 in Isleworth, where he died at the age of 83.
Well, a relatively happy end for Spot there, but we now see a new nationality introduced into the story, the Maltese. So, Mark, could you talk a little bit about this group of criminals?
Indeed, this is the famous Messina brothers, or the Mayfair Mafia, as they eventually became known. Control of the London vice business before the war had fallen into the hands mainly of criminals from Malta, principal amongst whom were the Messina brothers. Gangsters like Hill and Spot weren't interested in the vice game, and the Messinas and others took full advantage of this. Strictly speaking, the Messinas were only half Maltese. The father of the Messina clan, Giuseppe, originally came from Sicily, but moved to a town near Valletta, the Maltese capital, in 1896 when he was 18. Back in Sicily, he'd been involved in prostitution, and he quickly involved himself again in the brothel business in his new home. He also soon found himself a wife, a local girl called Vittoria de Bono. She bore him 2 sons in Malta, Salvatore and Alfredo. Malta at the time was part of the British Empire, and British citizenship was conferred by birth or marriage to a local. Giuseppe prospered in Malta and made a lot of money. However, in 1904, he decided to move his family to Alexandria in Egypt, where there were even richer pickings in the brothel and prostitution business. It was in Egypt that his 3 other sons, Eugenio, Attilo, and Carmelo, were born. Again, Giuseppe prospered. Over a number of years, he established a chain of brothels throughout Egypt, in Cairo, Port Said, and Suez, and even as far as Morocco. As the 5 Messina boys grew up, they all joined the family business. They also appear to have tried their hand at other criminal activities like gun running and drug smuggling. Messinas in all had a very good run in Egypt, but in 1932, amid an attempted clampdown on prostitutions, the authorities took the opportunity to kick them out. They went back first to Malta. Giuseppe took steps through bribery to ensure that his 3 sons born in Egypt acquired British passports. And over the next few years, led by Eugenio, the Messina boys made their way to Britain. In Britain, the brothers took on English names. Salvatore became Arthur Evans. Alfredo became Alfred Martin. Eugenio became Edward Marshall. Attilo became Raymond Maynard. Carmelo became Charles Maitland. The Messina name was, however, not so easy to lose, and they continued to be referred to most by their original name. When they arrived in London in the mid-30s, they found the vice business up for grabs. The laws governing prostitution were a bit of a mishmash, and the penalties were not severe. The maximum fine for soliciting was £2 and had been so for 100 years. As regards brothel keeping, there were a number of loopholes which could be exploited, and the penalties, again, though higher than £2, were not severe. The Messinas, of course, encountered competition when they entered the business in London, but most of the main players of the 20s and early 30s were either dead or in prison. The Sabinis, as we've seen, controlled Soho and the West End at the time. They did have some vice operations, but they were trifling when compared to their protection rackets and other mainstream criminal activities, and they didn't object to the Messinas moving in. The first necessity for the Messinas was a plentiful supply of girls, and they went about finding them. Most of the girls were imported from the continent. At the time, circa 1936, London working girls, many of whom were also foreign, tended to operate out of addresses in and around the Tottenham Court Road on the eastern borders of the West End. Many of the pimps running the girls were also foreign, mostly Italian or French. The Messinas chose not to operate there, firstly to avoid confrontation with the local pimps, and secondly, as with a number of girls the Messinas were acquiring, the area's streets would become overcrowded. They also thought the Tottenham Court Road area sleazy and believed they could find somewhere classier to operate. So they turned their attention to Mayfair, which had hitherto not been a main centre of prostitution. They started to rent or buy properties, presenting themselves to their new fancy neighbours as diplomats or dealers in fine gems. Then they set their girls up in these properties. At their peak, they had as many as 32 such brothels in operation. Messina girls were very strictly supervised, with Eugenio, or Edward as he now was, taking the lead. If they didn't do what they were told, they were bullied, beaten, disfigured, or even killed. And so World War II arrived, and the Messinas, or the Mayfair Mafia as they were now called, as I mentioned earlier, were kings of their seedy world and perfectly placed to exploit the huge business opportunities the war would bring with it. There was, however, a cloud on the horizon: conscription. As British passport holders, they were eligible to be called up, and they were. Their main response was simply not to respond at all or report for service. Somehow or other, they got away with it. Of course, they were extremely wealthy men, and no doubt some of their funds were channeled into the appropriate hands. For a flavour of how things work with the Messinas, we can take the example of a French lady called Martha Hochberg, a long-time Messina employee. Born in 1913, she worked as a prostitute on the continent from a young age, before deciding to try her luck in London. One of the commonest British sanctions against foreign prostitutes was deportation. Martha paid to enter into a marriage of convenience with a hard-up Englishman called Arthur Watts. Thenceforth, she was entitled to a British passport and was immune to deportation. She moved into a West End flat in Duke Street and began to ply her trade. In 1941, when the Blitz was at its height, Martha Watts, as she now was, met Eugenio Messina at a Soho drinking club. Eugenio saw Martha as a good prospect and wined and dined her and exerted his charm. It worked, and she joined the Messina team. Eugenio moved her into a flat in Berkeley Square, which Martha shared with 2 Belgian girls. Over the initial few weeks, she had to accommodate herself to the Messina's strict working regime. Girls were not allowed to dress provocatively, so as not to attract police attention. Girls using their flats for business were not allowed to spend more than 10 minutes with a client, and were not allowed to disrobe, which in any event was impractical in such a short period. The flats always had a maid who would ensure the rules were complied with, although this could not be done, of course, if girls chose to provide their services up against the street wall. Girls were prohibited from straying from their agreed beat. Shepherd Market was one of the most popular beats for Messina girls. While, to keep them in order, the Messinas might resort to violence against the girls were treated well at the same time. They were kept readily supplied with lavish gifts of clothes, jewelry, shoes, and scarce black market items and ration goods. Girls' working hours were normally from 4 p.m. to 6 a.m., and their spare time was spent mostly sleeping, unsurprisingly. No days off were allowed apart from on girls' birthdays. Eugenio, who had assumed the role of gang boss, was the most violent of the brothers. After one disagreement, he lashed Martha Watts mercilessly with a length of electric flex wire. Notwithstanding this, he retained a strong hold over her. She had her left breast tattooed with the words in French, "The man of my life, Gino the Maltese." Eugenio's violent streak sometimes got him into real trouble. Early on in the war, when a police constable told him his Cadillac was illegally parked, he smashed the officer's face in. Eugenio had to spend 6 weeks in prison. At the end of 1941, conscription was introduced for unmarried women. This might have been thought a problem for working girls, but in practice, if they inserted the word prostitute as their profession in response to call-up papers, the authorities left them alone. It was estimated that there were roughly 3,000 prostitutes on the London streets in 1931. By the end of World War II, this had more than doubled. The wartime working girls acquired nicknames, the commonest being the Piccadilly Commandos and the Hyde Park Rangers. Demand for their services rose hugely with the arrival of American servicemen in 1942, after the US's entry into the war. By just before D-Day in 1944, there were over 1.5 million of them in Britain. Initially, for some reason, the Messinas prohibited their girls from going with Americans, but they soon realized this was a big mistake and ended the prohibition. And because American military wages were much higher than those of their British counterparts, Messina prostitutes charged them more. The going rate for a short engagement was £5, 4 times more than the rate charged to British men. One American GI famously observed on being told the price, "Gee, honey, I want to rent it, not buy it." The Messina girls showed their own kind of wartime courage. When air raid sirens sounded and people ran for their shelters, they generally braved the bombs and carried on working. Apart from in brothels and on the streets, there were many nightclubs, drinking clubs, and spielers, spieler being another word for a drinking club, where girls would be available. A wartime journalist reported that there were over 100 drinking clubs to the north of Leicester Square, with what he called travelling white slaves, who would try and entice soldiers back to their flats. One particularly popular haunt was an officially run American servicemen's centre called the Rainbow Club, located on Shaftesbury Avenue in what had been Delmonico's restaurant. It was a magnet for non-working girls as well as prostitutes. It was also a magnet for black marketeers. Murder was an occasional risk for all prostitutes, but less so for Messina girls. While they may have given their prostitutes an occasional beating, the brothers did give them very good protection. As touched on in podcast 1, in the winter of 1942, 4 women were murdered on the streets of London by the same man. 3 of them were known prostitutes. The murderer, whom the newspapers christened the Blackout Ripper, turned out to be an RAF serviceman called Gordon Cummins. He claimed to be the bastard son of a lord and was known to his friends as Duke. He was hanged in 1942 at Wandsworth Prison. The war ended on a very busy note for Eugenio's prime employee, Martha Watts. On May the 8th, 1945, VE Day, according to her own evidence, she entertained 49 customers. So what happened to the Messinas after the war? In the immediate post-war years, things continued to go well, despite the disappearance of the Americans. Eugenio acquired his first Rolls-Royce, and the brothers continued to acquire properties in Mayfair for their girls. However, there were clouds on the horizon. In 1947, another Maltese pimp called Charlie Vassallo tried to muscle in on Martha Watts and some of the other Messina girls. Eugenio intervened and Vassallo had the tips of 3 fingers sliced off. A violent feud ensued, which culminated in the prosecution of Vassallo and some of his men for demanding money with menaces from the Messina women. They were convicted, but the publicity given the case cast an unpleasant and unwelcome light on the Messina brothers and their operations. Subsequently, Eugenio himself was brought to court in connection with his original violence against Vassallo. He was convicted of unlawful wounding, though not the more serious charge of inflicting GBH with intent, which carried a potential sentence of life. He got 3 years in Wandsworth. Things got worse when his brother Carmelo tried to bribe a prison officer on a visit to his brother. The incident was reported, and he too ended up in prison for bribery. On the basis of all the bad publicity the Messinas had received, there was pressure in Parliament for a commission to inquire into the vice industry in England, but the government declined to do so on the basis that such an investigation would hamper the police in the performance of their duties. As with Billy Hill when he was in prison, the Messina business continued to run smoothly in Eugenio's absence. The 1948 London Olympics brought many visitors to the capital, and Martha and the other girls did very well out of it. Eugenio got out in the summer of 1949. Soon, the man who would prove to be the brothers' nemesis went to work on them. Duncan Webb was a crime reporter for the People newspaper, which in those days had a circulation of over 5 million. In later years, no less an authority than Time magazine hailed Webb as the greatest crime reporter of our time. In 1950, he wrote a front-page article in his paper titled "Arrest These 4 Men," which related to his intensive investigation of the Messinas and their business. Pictured were all the Messina brothers, minus, for some reason, Alfredo. In his investigations, Webb spoke to something like 100 prostitutes, including Martha Watts. He visited numerous brothels. He, in fact, was the originator of that well-known journalistic phrase, "I made my excuses and left." He also looked into the Messina's property empire, and all in all came up with an extremely accurate picture of how the Messinas operate. Campbell was well aware of the risks his investigations carried and regulated his movements very carefully. The article created a huge sensation, and more articles followed. Campbell's Messina article set rolling a series of events which led ultimately to the brothers' demise as a force in the London underworld. The major impact was that at last the police began to take a really serious look at the full range of Messina activities. The brothers' response to the furor created by Campbell was, with the exception of Alfredo, to leave for Europe, leaving the running of the business to Martha and others. Alfredo was to regret not leaving when in 1951 he was arrested by the police and found guilty of living off immoral earnings. He got 2 years. He died in 1963 and was interred in the family grave at Gunnersbury Cemetery, where he joined his parents, who had eventually come to England and died just after the war. It took until 1959 for the police to get Attila, when he unwisely ventured back to England. He was given 4 years for living off prostitution. When he got out, he was deported as his British passport was deemed to be invalid. He lived out the rest of his life in San Remo, Italy, where he died in 1991. Eugenio went to France, then later Belgium, after the Campbell expose. He continued to recruit for the Messina girls back in London. By the mid-50s, Scotland Yard had been able to obtain the assistance of Interpol and other continental police authorities in their campaign against the brothers. In 1955, Eugenio and his brother Carmelo were arrested by Belgian police at a nightclub in the resort of Knokke-le-Zout. They were unlucky enough to be found with firearms on them. They were indicted on various charges, including incitement to prostitution and possession of prohibited arms, and were then remanded in custody for several months. They were convicted in due course. Eugenio got 6 years and Carmelo 10 months. Carmelo was immediately released on the basis of time served on remand, but the sentence was increased on appeal and a warrant was issued for him. He went on the run and ended up in Sicily, where he died of a stroke at the early age of 43. Eugenio was released from prison in Belgium in 1959 and joined Attila in San Remo. He still managed for a while to control a few London brothels from afar. In 1970, he married a 39-year-old Italian former prostitute. Within an hour or two of the wedding, he had a heart attack and died. What happened to the final brother Salvatore is a mystery. He went abroad at the same time as Eugenio, Carmelo, and Attila, but where he went is unknown, and no record of his death has been discovered anywhere. As for Martha Watts, she parted company with the Messinas in 1955. In 1960, she published her memoirs. It was claimed that she'd earned over £150,000, millions in today's money, for the Messinas in her time with them. When she retired from the game, she had accumulated over 400 convictions for prostitution. As the Messinas' control of the London vice market withered, naturally new men took over. Again, they were mostly Maltese, men with names like Mikolev, Mifsud, and Saliba. These, in turn, made way for others, but their story is for a different podcast series.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family, and if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.